Welcome to Module 2 of Gods, Goddesses, and Demons, Divinity in South Asia, in which we're going to transition from the larger category of what is the divine, or the idea of the divine, to discuss semi-divine or celestial beings, sages, and demons within the South Asian context. So now that we have an overview of each of these religious traditions, now we can start diving more deeply into the ways that people understand divinity by immediately complicating the concept of divinity. Because when you think of divinity, even from the position of Rudolf Otto that we saw last time, divinity is often thought of to be things that are transcendent, things that are extremely like omnipotent or omniscient. But here we actually see within divinity in South Asia that there's many different categories of semi-divine beings, beings that have more powers than humans, but often have less spiritual awareness than humans. So it helps us start building out the entire collection of beings that populate the cosmos and be able to think more deeply about exactly what is divinity when you complicate the concept by throwing in semi-divine beings who are simultaneously above and below humanity. So as we go through this, we're really going to start to compare these different beings as they exist in Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism. And so part of this, what you need to, I want to draw your attention to is in each of the readings are associated with a certain tradition. And so when you read them, I want to make sure you're paying attention to whether it's a Jain reading, a Buddhist reading, or a Hindu reading, or something that's a more overall overview that addresses multiple different religions, because this will help you eventually, as we do the assignments, to really be able to understand how each religious tradition views them differently. So as you do this, keep in mind, say if you read something about Jainism, keep in mind the overview that we went over on Jainism, and think about how they view the world, how they view, the idea of crossing over at the end and what this means in relationship to how beings can interact with them. So constantly keep in mind how the philosophies and practices of each religion informs how they understand semi-divine beings. So as we march through this second module, we're going to start off with readings about celestial beings, looking at musicians called Gandharvas, dancers known as Apsarasas, sages known as Rishis, and we'll start off with a broad overview by Oberles, in which we'll look at the category historically of Gandharvas and Apsarasas, which will apply to Hinduism primarily, but also the sort of a broader South Asian approach. So this will also apply to Buddhism and Jainism. We'll also read the Gandhava Samyutta, in which we see a Buddhist perspective on how people become Gandharvas, and then we'll read a selection from Dimit's reader of the Puranas, in which we'll see something about the seers or the rishis who are important within the Hindu pantheon. And along with these readings, we'll have lectures on the Gandharvas and Apsarasas, and also one on the Dhammapada. Once we finish this, following each of these different sections, you'll have a practice quiz in which you'll be able to refresh yourself on all the important concepts, and these again will help you towards your exam, which is at the end of this module. So after we've had our lectures and readings and quiz on celestial beings, we'll move forward into supernatural on earth, in which we'll discuss yakshas and yakshis, or yakshinis. So we'll start with Ann Kessler's reading on yakshas and yakshinis, which is again broadly conceived, focusing primarily on Hinduism, but giving us the actual principles for broader South Asian traditions, including Buddhism and Jainism. Then we'll read about Varanasi and the Yaksha, which is a Hindu story about the establishment of Varanasi and the Yaksha that was there. We'll read a story called the goddess Ambika, which is a Jain story about a Yakshi, which in Jainism translates to goddess, named Ambika, and how she became this goddess. And then lastly, we'll have this lecture where we tie everything together, in which we discuss yakshas and yakshinis. Of course, this will be followed by a practice quiz. Lastly, we'll turn to a scarier side of semi-divine beings, and we'll discuss demons, zombies, ghosts, and the Gana of Shiva. We'll start off again with a very broad overview from Hilary Rodriguez that discusses Asuras, Daityas, Danavas, Rakshasas, etc., and a whole bunch of these sort of scary semi-divine beings. And this is largely from the Hindu perspective, but it gives us a broad overview that applies to Buddhism and Jainism to a lesser extent. Then we'll transition from this overall reading to reading from the 22 goblins, in which we'll see some Hindu folk tales about this category being known as Vitala, which this translates as goblins. Some people translate it as zombies. Then we'll move to the Kalinkatupurani, which is a story about these beings called Pays, who often are also translated as goblins, who eat up blood and guts from the battlefield for the goddess. And then we'll read an inscription from a Jain perspective about a king named Jinadatta, in which he slays a whole kingdom full of demons. Of course, as with the other portions of this module, we'll have a lecture on demons, a lecture on these scary things, followed by practice quizzes. So as you complete these, now we have a broad understanding of the semi-divine beings in South Asia. We also have our first Encountering Divinity assignment. For this assignment, you'll be transported to the Great Stupa at Sanchi, and you have to explore this site virtually to be able to find some of these different semi-divine beings and also some scenes from the life story of the Buddha. The reason why we have this assignment is to help you apply the knowledge that you've learned about these beings to actually now be able to identify them in actual real life context. The goal of this assignment is not for you to get everything correct, again, because you're just starting your journey on South Asian religions. You're not an art historian yet. So right now it's just for you to make an attempt. And so part of this is not making the correct identification, but I want to see the logic that you use. And so as you look at this assignment, look at how I want you to identify these different beings and provide bullet point annotations to be able to show me why you've selected this. So the process, like in math, is showing your work. This is actually how you will accumulate the points, not necessarily coming up with the correct answer. Once you've completed this, then we'll move into our first discussion post. And in this discussion post, we're going to be bringing together the first and second module, asking these big questions about what is divinity, but particularly applying it through the rubric of the semi-divine. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to select a semi-divine being and work through it within the different religious traditions to be able to tell me something more broadly about how the religious views applies to these different semi-divine beings and how it shapes the religious understanding of them. After you've completed that, then we'll complete our first exam that deals with materials from Module 1 and 2, and that you've seen all of these questions before on the different practice quizzes. So good luck and see you soon.